Hey guys, tonight, we're stepping quietly into one of the largest slave societies the world has ever known. Imagine waking before sunrise, not because your alarm clock rang, but because someone else owned every hour of your life. Your clothes, your work, your food, even your future, belong to another person. But before we begin, if you enjoy relaxing history that helps you drift off to sleep, consider giving this video a like. It tells YouTube there are people who genuinely enjoy falling asleep while learning about ancient Rome, which might confuse the algorithm just enough to help us both. And if you'd like more peaceful journeys through history, subscribe. Before we continue, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see how many people from around the world gather here each night. Tonight, we'll quietly wander through bustling Roman markets, luxurious villas, smoky kitchens, dangerous mines, and crowded city streets to discover what it was really like to be a Roman slave. So, dim the lights, settle beneath your blankets, relax your shoulders, and let's slowly drift back, nearly 2,000 years, into the heart of ancient Rome. The city is still. Sleeping, somewhere beyond the darkened streets, the first pale light is beginning to touch the rooftops. The great temples stand quietly beneath the fading stars. Narrow lanes are cool and empty, while inside countless homes, people are beginning to stir. A door opens, a sandal touches the floor, a clay lamp flickers. For some Romans, the coming day means business, politics, shopping, or perhaps a long breakfast beneath the shade of a courtyard. For others, the day has already begun. These are the enslaved people of Rome. They are not gathered in one place. They are everywhere. They carry water through narrow streets. They sweep marble floors. They prepare meals, wash clothing, tend gardens, care for children, work in fields, shape metal, carry stone, and turn the machinery of Roman life from behind the scenes. Some live in elegant villas where fountains murmur beneath painted walls. Others sleep in cramped quarters, far from sunlight, after exhausting days of labor. Some are skilled teachers, accountants, craftsmen, or musicians. Others perform work so dangerous that their lives may be measured in months or years, and yet, despite these differences, one fact connects them: they are owned. Roman law treated enslaved people as property, although their lives were far more complicated than that simple word suggests. They could form relationships, learn skills, earn money in certain circumstances, and sometimes eventually receive freedom. But none of these possibilities changed the central reality: their freedom belonged to someone else. The Roman world was built around this contradiction. It celebrated ideas of citizenship, law, honor, and personal dignity, while millions of human beings lived without legal independence. The wealthy Roman walking beneath a colonnade might pass a silent servant carrying a tray. A senator might speak proudly of liberty while surrounded by people who possessed none. A child might grow up believing that the person who dressed them, taught them, and comforted them was simply part of the household, without understanding that this person could be bought or sold. And perhaps that is what makes the history of Roman slavery so difficult to see clearly. It was ordinary. It was woven into everyday life so deeply that many Romans barely noticed it. The empire did not function only through emperors and soldiers. It depended upon countless quiet hands, people whose names have mostly disappeared, whose voices were rarely recorded, and whose stories survive only in scattered inscriptions, legal documents, archaeological remains, and passing references. Tonight, we will try to listen for those voices, not through the grand speeches of emperors, but through the small details: a wooden door closing before dawn, the weight of a water jar, the smell of bread rising in a kitchen, the sound of footsteps across a villa corridor, the distant clatter of chains in a marketplace, and somewhere, perhaps, the quiet hope of a person wondering whether freedom might one day become possible. But before anyone could dream of freedom, they first had to enter this strange and uncertain world, and so, as the Roman city slowly wakes around us, our journey begins with a question that could change everything. Who, exactly, became a Roman slave? Because the answer was far more complicated than many people imagine, and for some, the journey into bondage began not in a distant battlefield, but in a home, a courtroom, a debt, or a single unfortunate moment that changed the course of an entire life. That is where we will quietly go next, following the uncertain paths that led ordinary human beings into slavery, beneath the vast shadow of Rome. The city is waking now. Behind us, the quiet streets of Rome are filling with footsteps. Doors open. Voices drift from courtyards. Somewhere, a baker is already preparing the first bread of the day, while carts begin to move along the ancient roads, and among all these ordinary sounds, there are people whose lives have suddenly become anything but ordinary. To understand Roman slavery, we have to step away from the markets for a moment and ask a more personal question. How did a person become a slave? The answer was not always simple. Some people were captured during wars. Rome fought for centuries, expanding across Italy, the Mediterranean, Gaul, Greece, North Africa, and beyond. When armies conquered cities and territories, prisoners could be taken away and sold. A person who had lived for years in a familiar home might suddenly find themselves walking under guard, surrounded by strangers, with no idea where they would sleep that night. For them, slavery could begin with the sound of soldiers arriving, but war was only one path. Children born to enslaved mothers were generally born into slavery themselves. This meant that an entire lifetime could unfold within the same system. A child might grow up in a Roman household, learn the language, become familiar with its streets, and still never possess the legal freedom that surrounded them. They might know Rome as their only home, and yet never truly belong to themselves. There were also people who entered slavery through piracy and kidnapping. The Mediterranean was a busy sea, crowded with merchants, sailors, fishermen, and travelers. It was also dangerous. Pirates could seize people and sell them far from their original homes. Imagine leaving your village expecting to return before winter, and instead finding yourself transported to a distant port. Your name might remain the same, your memories might remain, but everything around you would be unfamiliar. There were also cases involving debt, although the legal situation was complicated and changed over Roman history. Early Roman traditions remembered forms of debt bondage, while later Roman law generally did not treat ordinary unpaid debt as a simple path into permanent slavery. Still, poverty could make vulnerable people easier to exploit, and desperate families could find themselves trapped in difficult circumstances. Then there were children abandoned after birth. In the ancient world, infants could be exposed or abandoned for many reasons, including poverty and family hardship. Some were rescued and raised by others, but might later be claimed or treated as enslaved. The line between survival and bondage could be painfully thin. And then there was the world of commerce. Once a person had been enslaved, their future could be shaped by the decisions of people they had never met. They might be sold to a farmer, a merchant, a household, a workshop owner, or a wealthy Roman with dozens or even hundreds of enslaved workers. A young person with a strong body might be sent toward heavy labor. Someone with education might be purchased for administrative work. A child with a gentle personality might be brought into a wealthy household. Skills mattered, age mattered, appearance mattered, health mattered, and sometimes, simple chance mattered most of all. Two people captured in the same conflict could end up living completely different lives. One might spend years working outdoors beneath the Mediterranean sun. Another might find themselves inside a wealthy villa, carrying messages and managing accounts. One could eventually earn enough money to hope for freedom. Another might never have such an opportunity. This uncertainty was one of the quiet terrors of slavery. You could not always know what waited ahead. The moment of capture was only the beginning. Soon, you might be examined by strangers, separated from people you knew, and placed into a system that valued you according to what someone else believed you were worth. Perhaps you would be standing in a busy port, perhaps beneath the shade of a market awning, perhaps surrounded by other frightened people, listening to unfamiliar voices discussing prices. And as the sun climbed higher over the Roman world, your life would become a transaction. The next place we visit is one of the most unsettling spaces in this journey, the Roman slave market. There, human beings were presented, evaluated, and purchased, while the ordinary business of ancient Rome continued around them. The marketplace is already awake. As the morning light spreads across the rooftops, the sounds of ancient Rome gather around us. Wooden wheels roll over uneven stones. Sandals brush against dusty streets. Merchants call to one another, and somewhere nearby, a fountain spills water into a shallow basin. But beneath the ordinary noise of commerce, another kind of business is taking place. People are being bought. The Roman world depended upon markets, and enslaved human beings could become part of that enormous system of trade. They might arrive after military campaigns, through piracy, kidnapping, or the movement of existing slave populations. From ports and provincial towns, they could be transported toward places where buyers were waiting. Rome itself was an important destination, but the trade was spread across the empire. Markets existed in many cities, and large auctions could take place in public spaces where buyers gathered for different reasons. A farmer might need workers for his land. A wealthy household might be looking for servants. A merchant could seek someone with useful skills, and sometimes a buyer was simply looking for a person who could be resold later for profit. The market itself could feel strangely ordinary. That may be one of the most unsettling things about it. There were no separate worlds dividing human commerce from every other kind of commerce. The same civilization that traded olive oil, wine, pottery, cloth, and animals could also trade people. The marketplace continued its daily rhythm. A merchant might stand beneath a wooden shelter, a buyer might ask questions, an enslaved person might wait quietly nearby. The business could be conducted with the calm efficiency of any other transaction. Roman sellers sometimes used platforms or raised areas to display enslaved people to potential buyers. Written information could be provided about age, health, skills, and other qualities that might affect a person's value. For the buyer, these details were practical. For the person being examined, they could feel like a judgment on their entire existence. Imagine standing among strangers while someone discusses your abilities as if you were a tool. Can you read? Can you cook? Can you sew? Do you know how to manage accounts? Can you work with animals? Have you been trained in medicine? Can you teach children? The answers could determine where you went next. A person with valuable skills might be purchased for a high price and sent into a wealthy household. Someone considered strong enough for heavy labor could be directed toward farms, workshops, or construction. Children might be purchased for domestic service or raised within households. And there was another uncertainty, the possibility of being separated. Families could be divided through sale. Friends who had survived capture together might suddenly disappear in different directions. A mother might not know where her child would be taken. A brother might be sold to one buyer while his sister went elsewhere. There were no guarantees that the people standing beside you in the market would still be there by sunset. The Roman legal system recognized certain protections around transactions, but these were largely concerned with the interests of buyers and sellers. The condition of the enslaved person mattered because it affected the value of the property being purchased. That distinction reveals something important about Roman society. The law could recognize that an enslaved person was human, while simultaneously treating that person as someone who could be owned. This contradiction followed enslaved people everywhere, and once the transaction was completed, the uncertainty did not necessarily end. A new owner might be kind by the standards of the ancient world, another might be cruel. One might allow an enslaved worker to live with a partner or earn money, another might separate families without hesitation. The market could determine the direction of a person's life, but it could not predict what kind of master waited at the end of the road. Perhaps a young woman was purchased for a household in Rome. Perhaps a skilled craftsman was sent to a workshop. Perhaps a farmer acquired several workers for his estate. Perhaps a wealthy Roman bought someone simply because he wanted another person to serve at dinner. Each purchase created a different story. And for the person being sold, there was often no opportunity to choose. The seller received the payment, the buyer received the person, and somewhere beyond the noise of the marketplace, another journey began. A new name might be given, a new home might appear, a new set of duties would soon be expected. The marketplace slowly fades behind us now, and we follow one person away from the crowded stalls, through unfamiliar streets, toward the place where their new life is about to begin. Because the most difficult moment may not have been the sale itself, it may have been the first morning after it, when the reality finally settled in. The person who owned your future had already decided what you would do, and tomorrow, you would have to wake up and begin. The marketplace is far behind now. The voices have faded into the distance, replaced by the softer sounds of an unfamiliar neighborhood. Perhaps the person we have been following is walking beside a merchant. Perhaps they have been placed into a cart. Perhaps they are simply making their way through the streets beneath the watchful eyes of someone who now claims ownership over them. The journey may take minutes or days, but eventually, there is a door. And behind that door, a new life waits. For someone newly enslaved, the first day in a new household could be filled with uncertainty. Nothing was familiar. The walls looked different. The voices sounded strange. Even the rhythm of the day belonged to someone else. There might be a courtyard with a fountain, a kitchen filled with smoke, a stable smelling of hay and animals, a workshop crowded with tools, or perhaps a large country estate surrounded by fields. The person arriving could not know what kind of life awaited them. They might be introduced to other enslaved people first. In a large household, these workers could form a complicated community. Some had lived there for years. Others had been born there. A few might have arrived only recently. Their reactions to a newcomer could vary. Someone might offer quiet advice, someone else might keep their distance, and another might simply continue working, too tired or too cautious to become involved. The newcomer would need to learn quickly. Where was the water kept? Which room was the kitchen? When did work begin? Where could they sleep? Who gave orders? Who was safe to approach? These questions were not written down in a handbook. They were learned by watching. A glance from one worker could communicate more than words. A gesture toward a particular doorway, a warning whispered while carrying a basket. In this way, enslaved people often created their own networks of knowledge within the households where they lived. The owner might control the legal structure, but daily survival depended upon understanding the people. Around you, for some, the first task might be something simple: carrying water, sweeping a floor, preparing vegetables, cleaning a room, but the simplicity of the task could be misleading. A new worker was being observed. Could they be trusted? Were they strong? Were they skilled? Did they understand instructions? Could they be useful in another part of the household? The answers might determine their future. A person who demonstrated talent could sometimes be moved into more specialized work. Someone with knowledge of reading or writing might be assigned administrative duties. A skilled craftsperson might be sent to a workshop. A young person might be trained in domestic service, but every new skill came with another possibility. Greater usefulness could sometimes mean greater value to the owner. The first day could also involve a change of identity. Names might be altered. A person could be given a name associated with their place of origin, their appearance, or simply a name chosen by the household. For someone who had already lost their freedom, losing control over their name could feel like another quiet separation from the person they once were. And yet, life continued. The sun moved across the sky, meals were prepared, water was carried, doors opened and closed. The ordinary machinery of the household did not pause to acknowledge the person who had just entered it. That was perhaps the strangest part. The world kept moving. Someone might laugh in another room. A child might run across a courtyard. A dog might sleep in the shade. A servant might polish a bronze vessel until it reflected the afternoon light. And somewhere, among all of this, a newcomer was trying to understand where they belonged. Night eventually arrived. The first evening could bring a strange mixture of exhaustion and silence. The person might lie awake listening to unfamiliar footsteps. Perhaps they wondered about the people they had left behind. Perhaps they imagined returning home. Perhaps they tried not to imagine anything at all, because the mind sometimes protects itself by becoming very quiet, and then morning would come again. The first day had ended, but the first day had also revealed something important. Slavery in Rome was not one single experience. It changed depending upon where a person lived, who owned them, what skills they possessed, and what work they were expected to perform. For some, the next chapter would unfold inside a magnificent Roman villa, surrounded by marble, gardens, fountains, and beautiful painted walls. From the outside, such a place might look like paradise, but behind those elegant walls, another world was quietly working. And as dawn approaches once more, we follow our story toward the grand entrance of a wealthy Roman household, where luxury and bondage existed side by side. Morning arrives gently over the countryside. The first light touches the tops of cypress trees, then slowly moves across tiled roofs and pale stone walls. Beyond the entrance of the villa, gardens are still covered in a thin veil of mist. From a distance, the house looks almost peaceful. A wealthy Roman villa could be an extraordinary place. There might be marble floors arranged in colorful mosaics, painted walls showing gods and heroes, fountains murmuring in shaded courtyards, and gardens filled with roses, herbs, fruit trees, and carefully trimmed shrubs. Guests could arrive through impressive entrances. They might dine beneath painted ceilings. They might walk beside pools of cool water while servants carried refreshments behind them. But behind this beauty, there was an enormous amount of work. A villa was not simply a home. It was a small world, and that world depended upon people whose names were rarely remembered. Before the owner woke, someone had already opened doors. Someone had cleaned the rooms. Someone had prepared water. Someone had swept away yesterday's dust. Someone had checked the kitchens. Someone had cared for the animals. Someone had made sure the household could begin another day without interruption. The larger the villa, the more complicated this system became. A wealthy family might have many enslaved workers, each assigned to different responsibilities. Some worked inside the main house. Others lived near the kitchens or storage areas. Some cared for gardens. Others looked after horses and livestock. There could even be people whose jobs involved organizing the work of other enslaved people. This created a hierarchy within the household. Not everyone experienced slavery in the same way. An enslaved person who managed accounts or supervised workers might have more influence than someone carrying heavy loads. A trusted household servant could sometimes move through parts of the villa that others rarely entered. They might know the family's habits. They might understand its finances. They might even have access to information that free outsiders never heard. Yet this apparent privilege remained fragile, no matter how important a person became. Their legal status could remain unchanged. The villa itself was a place of contrasts. Imagine walking through a grand dining room. The walls are covered with colorful paintings. Bronze lamps shine softly. A fountain whispers in the courtyard. The guests recline comfortably while food arrives in endless courses. And just beyond the doorway, someone is waiting. A servant stands silently, holding a tray. Another watches the guests carefully, ready to refill a cup. Someone else is preparing the next dish. The beauty of the room depends upon their constant attention. The wealthy guests may remember the meal. They may admire the mosaic floor. They may discuss the wine. But they may never remember the people who made it all possible. For the enslaved workers, the villa had its own geography. There were rooms where they could enter freely, rooms where they entered only when summoned, and places where they were never expected to go unless they had work to perform. They learned to move quietly, to anticipate requests, to notice when a guest had finished eating, to recognize which footsteps belonged to the master of the household, and sometimes to understand the mood of a person before that person spoke. This was a skill in itself. The atmosphere of a wealthy home could change quickly. A peaceful breakfast might become tense because of an argument. A celebration might suddenly create extra work. An unexpected visitor could mean hours of preparation. The household workers had to adjust. Their own plans, if they had any, came second. The villa also connected enslaved people to a wider network. Food arrived from farms. Olive oil came in clay containers. Wine was stored in large vessels. Textiles, furniture, and luxury goods traveled through Roman trade routes. The villa consumed all of these things, and the people working there kept the entire system moving. Yet perhaps the most unusual part of life inside a wealthy Roman villa was the closeness between owner and enslaved worker. They could spend years living under the same roof. A servant might care for a Roman child from infancy. They might watch that child grow. They might teach them words, comfort them when they were ill, carry them when they were small, and still, the relationship existed within an unequal system. Affection could exist. Trust could exist, even genuine friendship might exist, but ownership remained. That complicated reality followed people through every room of the villa. And when the evening meal finally ended, when guests left the dining room and lamps burned lower, the workers did not simply disappear. Their day continued, because somewhere behind the beautiful walls, the kitchen was still warm. The ovens were still glowing, and tomorrow's meal was already beginning to demand attention. So we leave the quiet courtyard behind, and follow the scent of smoke, bread, herbs, and roasted meat, toward the busiest room in the entire household, the kitchen, a place where Roman luxury was created, one exhausting task at a time. The villa is quiet again, but only for a moment, before the first guests appear, before the owner steps into the courtyard, before the household begins to speak loudly enough to fill the rooms. The work has already started. Inside a wealthy Roman home, enslaved household workers were responsible for countless small tasks. Many of these duties were so ordinary that they would barely have been noticed by the people who benefited from them, and perhaps that was the point. A successful household was expected to run smoothly, doors opened when needed, water appeared when requested, clothes were clean, rooms were orderly, meals arrived at the right moment, messages reached their destinations. The work disappeared, but the workers did not, at least, not to one another. The day might begin with cleaning, floors had to be swept, dust removed, furniture wiped, and rooms prepared. In wealthy homes, decorative objects could be valuable and delicate. A careless movement might damage a bronze vessel or disturb a carefully arranged display. Some workers learned to handle these things with extraordinary precision. Others were responsible for clothing. Laundry was hard work in the ancient world. There were no washing machines, no modern detergents, and no easy way to clean large amounts of fabric. Clothes could be soaked, scrubbed, beaten, rinsed, and dried. The work required strength. It also required time, and once the garments were clean, they might need to be folded, repaired, or prepared for the next day. Then there was water. Water was essential to Roman life, but even with aqueducts and fountains, getting water to every room was another matter. Enslaved workers might carry containers through the household, filling basins and supplying kitchens. The weight of a full vessel was considerable. One trip became many, many became hundreds over the course of a lifetime. Some servants were assigned to personal care. They might help their masters dress, prepare cosmetics, arrange hair, carry belongings, hold umbrellas or shade devices outdoors, assist elderly members of the household. Others cared for children. This could be one of the most emotionally complicated roles. An enslaved woman might spend years caring for a Roman child. She could wake when the child cried, comfort them when they were frightened, teach them household routines, walk beside them as they grew. The child might become deeply attached to her, but the relationship existed within an unequal world. The child was free, the caregiver was not. That contrast could remain invisible to the child for years. There were also messengers. A household could be large and busy, and information had to move constantly. A servant might carry a message from one room to another, then perhaps beyond the villa itself. They could be sent into the city to deliver letters, purchase supplies, or find a particular person. This meant that some enslaved workers became familiar with the streets of Rome. They knew shortcuts, they recognized merchants, they understood where to buy certain goods. In a strange way, the city could become more familiar to them than the home where they lived. Other workers performed duties that were almost invisible. They managed lamps, they prepared bedding, they cared for household animals, they maintained gardens, they repaired simple objects. They kept track of supplies, they watched for guests arriving at the gate. The list could seem endless, and because the household was built around hierarchy, every worker had to understand where they stood. A person serving wine at dinner was not necessarily equal to someone supervising the storerooms. A trusted household manager might have authority over others. A young servant might spend years learning the expectations of a particular family. The household became a miniature society, with its own rules, relationships, rivalries, friendships, and quiet alliances. Sometimes, enslaved workers could earn small amounts of money or receive gifts. Some owners allowed trusted servants to manage personal funds. These arrangements could create a small degree of independence, but they did not erase the larger reality. The person remained legally dependent upon the owner. A worker could be rewarded one day and punished the next. The uncertainty never completely disappeared. Perhaps the most exhausting part was the expectation of constant availability. A household worker could not simply decide that the day was over. If someone called, you answered. If a guest arrived late, you worked late. If an important visitor appeared unexpectedly, the entire household adjusted, and so, as the evening deepens, the great villa begins to settle, the lamps burn lower, the corridors become quieter. But from one doorway comes another sound, the soft crackle of fire, the clatter of bronze pots, the smell of herbs, onions, bread, and roasted meat. The kitchen workers are still awake, and if the dining room was the place where Roman wealth was displayed, the kitchen was where that wealth was transformed into something people could taste. Behind every lavish feast, there were tired hands preparing it, and that is where our journey leads next, into the heat, smoke, and endless labor of the Roman kitchen. The smell reaches us before the room comes into view: warm bread, crushed herbs, smoke from burning wood, the rich scent of meat slowly roasting over an open fire, and beneath it all, the sharp heat of a kitchen that has been awake for hours. We have entered one of the busiest places in a wealthy Roman household, the kitchen. To a guest arriving for dinner, a Roman feast might seem effortless. Food simply appeared, a platter was carried into the dining room. Wine was poured, the next course followed, but behind that smooth performance was a world of heat, noise, exhaustion, and constant preparation, and much of that work was performed by enslaved people. Roman kitchens were not always grand spaces. In many homes, they were practical, smoky rooms built around fireplaces and ovens. The air could become thick with smoke, especially when ventilation was poor. There were no modern exhaust systems, no electric appliances, no convenient way to control the temperature. Cooking depended upon fire, and fire had to be managed carefully. Someone had to keep it alive, someone had to add wood, someone had to judge the heat, and someone had to know exactly when the food was ready. A skilled kitchen worker could become extremely valuable. Cooking was not simply a matter of placing food over flames. A large Roman household could require complex preparation. Grain had to be ground, vegetables cleaned, meat prepared, fish handled carefully, sauces mixed, bread baked, fruit washed, herbs crushed, and everything had to be ready at the right moment. The kitchen could begin working long before the guests arrived. While the wealthy members of the household were still sleeping, workers might already be preparing dough, a fire would be burning, water would be heated, ingredients would be measured, the day's meal would slowly take shape. Some kitchens may have had specialized workers. One person might focus on baking, another on sauces, another on preparing meat. Someone else might manage storage. In very wealthy households, there could even be cooks with reputations for exceptional skill. A talented cook could command respect. Perhaps they understood which herbs balanced a particular dish. Perhaps they knew how to prepare food in ways that impressed important guests. Perhaps they had learned techniques from another region of the empire. Rome was an enormous world, and its cuisine reflected that. Ingredients traveled long distances, spices came from faraway lands, olives and olive oil were common, wine flowed through the empire. Fish sauces added intense flavor. Exotic ingredients could become symbols of wealth, but every luxury had a hidden cost in labor. The more elaborate the meal, the more people were needed to prepare it, and the kitchen was not a peaceful place. Even on an ordinary day, there could be pressure. A dish might burn, a guest might arrive unexpectedly, the master of the house might demand something different. An important visitor could require an especially impressive meal. The workers had to respond immediately. There was little room for mistakes. A Roman feast could last for hours. While guests reclined comfortably in the dining room, the kitchen workers remained active. They carried heavy dishes, refilled containers, prepared new courses, cleaned utensils, returned to the fire, and then began again. The distance between the dining room and the kitchen was therefore more than physical, it was social. In one room, people reclined and talked. In the other, people stood and worked. One side experienced abundance, the other created it, and yet, the kitchen could also become a place where enslaved workers developed their own expertise. Knowledge was valuable. A person who knew how to prepare food well might become difficult to replace. They could teach others, they might supervise younger workers, they could gain a certain level of trust. This did not mean freedom, but skill could sometimes provide a little protection. The kitchen was also a place where people worked closely together. They shared tasks, shared information, and perhaps, when the owner was not nearby, shared quiet conversations. In these moments, the kitchen became more than a workplace. It became a small community. The fire provided warmth during cold evenings. The smell of food filled the air. Someone might quietly sing while kneading dough. Another might tell a story from a distant homeland. For a brief moment, the kitchen could feel almost peaceful, but the work continued, and when the final dish left the room, the labor was not finished. Pots still needed cleaning, ashes needed clearing, leftover food had to be stored, the fire had to be reduced, the floor had to be swept. Only then could the workers finally rest. Outside, the villa was quiet. The guests had finished eating, the lamps were glowing softly, but somewhere beyond the dining room, the kitchen workers were still washing the evidence of the feast from their hands, and as we leave the warmth of the fire behind, we begin to wonder where these exhausted workers went when the day was finally over. Because even after hours of labor, there was another question waiting. Where did a Roman slave actually sleep? Not in the comfortable bedrooms of the people they served, but somewhere else, in the hidden spaces of the household, and those spaces reveal another quiet truth about life in ancient Rome. Even at night, privacy was a luxury that many enslaved people could rarely afford. The kitchen has finally gone quiet, the fire has burned low, the last bronze vessel has been placed aside, the smell of smoke still clings to the walls, but the household itself is beginning to settle into darkness. For the wealthy family, the night means comfort, soft mattresses, warm blankets, quiet bedrooms, perhaps even music drifting through an open courtyard. But for many enslaved people, sleep was something different. Not necessarily because every enslaved person lived in terrible conditions. The Roman world was too varied for such a simple picture. Some domestic workers may have slept in reasonably comfortable rooms. Others shared crowded quarters. Some slept near the kitchens or storage areas. Others lived in small rooms attached to the household. On farms and estates, workers might sleep in simple barracks or communal spaces. The location depended upon the owner's wealth, the type of work being performed, and the structure of the household. But one thing was common: the sleeping arrangements were rarely designed around privacy. Imagine the end of a long day. You have spent hours carrying water, cleaning rooms, preparing food, caring for children, or working outdoors. At last, the household becomes quiet. You walk toward the place where you sleep. Perhaps it is a small room, perhaps a corner shared with several others, perhaps a simple space near the work area. Your bed might be little more than a woven mat, a blanket, a wooden frame, or a mattress stuffed with straw or other materials. The Roman world knew great luxury. Soft mattresses filled with wool or feathers existed, but such comforts were not available to everyone. For many ordinary workers, sleeping arrangements were much simpler. And even when the bedding was adequate, the night might not be peaceful. A household worker could be called upon at almost any hour. A child might wake, a visitor might arrive late, an owner might need something, a lamp might need attention, a message might have to be delivered. The boundaries between work and rest were not always clear. This is one of the most important differences between ancient slavery and modern employment. An enslaved person did not simply finish a shift and return to a separate private life. The person belonged to the household. Their time could be demanded, their movements could be controlled, their sleeping place itself might be connected to their duties. A servant responsible for watching over a child might sleep nearby. Someone who worked in the kitchen might remain close to the cooking area. A stable worker could sleep near the animals. The arrangement was practical, but it also meant that work was always close. There were no weekends in the modern sense, no guaranteed evenings free from responsibility, no promise that tomorrow would be easier, and yet, night could still bring moments of quiet. When the lamps were extinguished and the villa became silent, enslaved workers might finally have a few hours when no one was asking anything from them. Perhaps someone whispered with a friend, perhaps a small group shared stories. Perhaps a person thought about home. The darkness could become a private space, even when the room itself was not private. Memory could travel farther than the body. Someone born in Greece might remember the sea. Someone from Gaul might remember forests. Someone from North Africa might remember the heat of their childhood home. These memories could survive even when everything else had changed. For those who had been enslaved for many years, however, the memories might become blurred. The old home could begin to feel like a dream. New streets became familiar, new faces became ordinary. A person could slowly build a life within circumstances they had never chosen. That does not mean they accepted slavery. It means human beings are capable of adapting to almost anything, and sometimes adaptation is not the same as acceptance. The night also brought another kind of uncertainty. In the ancient world, fire was essential. It provided warmth and light. But it could also become dangerous. A poorly managed lamp or cooking fire could threaten an entire building. Enslaved workers might be among those responsible for preventing such accidents. Even during the hours when others slept, someone remained alert. The city itself never became completely silent. From outside, there might be distant footsteps, a cart moving through the darkness, voices from a nearby street, dogs barking, the occasional sound of someone returning home late. Rome was alive even at night, and inside one household, another night slowly passed. A servant turns onto a simple mat. The candle beside them flickers. For a moment, there is nothing to do, nothing to carry, nothing to clean, nothing to answer, just darkness, and perhaps, in that darkness, the strange feeling of being temporarily alone. Then the first light begins to appear, another morning approaches, and with it, another question. After working through the day and sleeping in whatever space was provided, what did enslaved people actually eat? The answer may surprise us, because Roman food was not simply divided into rich meals for free people and starvation for slaves. The reality was more complicated, and hidden inside the ordinary foods that filled the kitchens of the Roman world. The morning begins with a familiar sound, a grinding stone turning slowly, grain being crushed, a wooden spoon moving through a thick pot, and somewhere nearby, bread is beginning to bake. For many enslaved people in the Roman world, food was not a matter of grand banquets. It was something much simpler, something practical, something that had to provide enough energy to keep the body working. The meals of enslaved people varied enormously depending on where they lived and what work they performed. A domestic servant in a wealthy villa might have access to leftovers from the household. A farm worker might receive basic grain rations. Someone working in a workshop might eat simple meals near the place of labor. And a person employed in a dangerous mine could face very different conditions. There was no single Roman slave diet, but across much of the ancient world, grain was central. Wheat, barley, other cereals depending upon the region. Grain could be turned into bread or cooked into a thick porridge for people doing physical labor. These foods were valuable because they provided energy. A simple meal might begin with a bowl of grain porridge. Perhaps some bread, maybe vegetables, beans, or lentils, olives, on occasion, cheese. Food did not need to be luxurious to be filling, and for someone who had spent hours working outdoors, a warm bowl of grain could be deeply satisfying. The Mediterranean world also provided a variety of fruits and vegetables: onions, garlic, cabbage, lettuce, figs, grapes, dates in some regions. The exact food available depended heavily upon geography and season. Roman farmers produced enormous quantities of agricultural goods, but access to them was not equal. A wealthy household might have a large variety of foods. Someone living in a poor or isolated environment might have very little choice. The same empire could contain both abundance and hunger. One of the most important foods was also one of the simplest: bread. Roman society depended heavily upon grain supplies. The city of Rome itself required enormous amounts of food. Ships carried grain across the Mediterranean, mills processed it, bakers turned it into bread. And behind every loaf were countless workers, some of them enslaved. For an enslaved person, bread could be the foundation of the daily diet, but food was also connected to control. Owners had an economic reason to keep workers alive and capable of labor. Providing sufficient food was not necessarily an act of kindness. It was also an investment. A healthy worker could work, a sick worker could not. This cold economic logic existed alongside the human reality of hunger. The amount and quality of food could differ greatly. Some owners may have provided reasonable rations, others may have been more restrictive. On large agricultural estates, food could be distributed according to established routines. Workers might receive measured amounts of grain, perhaps wine or a diluted drink. Sometimes additional foods could be available. Legumes were especially useful because they were inexpensive and filling. Olives and olive oil were common in many parts of the empire. Fish sauce, known as garum, added flavor to many Roman dishes, but the people eating simple meals would rarely experience the elaborate cuisine described in stories about wealthy Roman banquets. The rich might enjoy rare delicacies. The poor and enslaved often relied upon familiar staples. Still, the kitchen could offer unexpected opportunities. A worker preparing food might taste small amounts during cooking. A servant in a wealthy household might receive leftovers. And food could sometimes become a form of reward. An owner might provide better meals to trusted workers. A worker might receive a special portion during a festival. These moments could feel significant, because when your daily life is controlled by someone else, even something as ordinary as food can become important. Food also created connections between people. Workers ate together, they shared bread, they exchanged ingredients. Someone might bring a handful of olives, another might have extra vegetables. A person from another region might introduce a familiar dish from home. In this way, the Roman world became a mixture of cuisines and traditions. Slavery moved people across enormous distances, and people carried their memories with them. A flavor could remind someone of childhood. A particular herb could bring back the memory of another place. A simple piece of bread could become connected to a world that no longer existed. But not everyone received enough. In difficult times, shortages could affect the entire population. Poor harvests, high prices, transportation problems, natural disasters, all could make food harder to obtain. And for those already living at the edge of survival, even a small shortage could become dangerous. So, when we imagine the daily meal of a Roman slave, we should not picture one universal plate. We should imagine thousands of different tables, some with bread and beans, some with porridge and vegetables, some with leftovers from wealthy kitchens, and some with barely enough. The Roman world could feed enormous cities, yet the people who produced and prepared that food did not always share equally in its abundance. And now, as we leave the quiet kitchen and follow the scent of grain beyond the villa, we begin to see another side of Roman labor: fields stretching beneath the sun, workshops filled with smoke, stone being carried, metal being shaped, and beneath the ordinary rhythm of production, the lives of people whose bodies were expected to keep working. Tomorrow, we will leave the comfort of the household behind and walk into the harder world of farms and workshops. There, the work would be heavier, the days longer, and the dangers much closer. The peaceful villa is behind us now, the marble floors disappear, the fountains grow distant, and slowly, the landscape changes. The road stretches beyond the city, passing fields of grain, olive trees, vineyards, and small farms scattered beneath the Roman sun. Here, life moves differently. There are fewer painted walls, fewer fountains, no elegant dining rooms waiting at the end of the day. Instead, there is soil, wood, stone, metal, and work that begins with the rising sun. For many enslaved people, agricultural labor was among the most demanding forms of work in the Roman world. Large estates could depend heavily upon enslaved workers. Fields had to be plowed, seeds planted, crops harvested, grapes gathered, olives collected, animals fed, fences repaired. The work followed the seasons, and every season brought its own demands. During harvest, the pace could become especially intense. A crop could not simply wait. Once grapes were ready, they had to be gathered. Once olives were ripe, they had to be collected. Grain had to be harvested before weather damaged it. This meant long days of physical labor. The sun could be relentless. In summer, the fields offered little shade. Workers carried heavy baskets, bent over crops, dragged tools through dry soil, and walked back and forth across the same land again and again. For someone who had lived in a city, the countryside could feel strangely quiet, but quiet did not mean easy. The land demanded constant attention, and then there were animals. Caring for livestock was another important responsibility. Cattle, sheep, goats, horses, donkeys, each required food and care. Animals could become sick, they could escape, they could injure people. A worker responsible for them had to remain alert. Beyond agriculture, enslaved labor was also common in workshops. Roman cities were filled with craftsmen. Potters shaped clay, metalworkers forged tools, carpenters worked with wood, stonecutters shaped building materials, textile workers spun and wove fibers. Many of these occupations required real skill. An enslaved person could spend years learning a craft. A young worker might begin with simple tasks, preparing materials, cleaning tools, carrying supplies, watching an experienced craftsman. Over time, they might learn more complicated techniques. Skill could sometimes improve a person's position, but it could also make them more valuable to an owner. A talented craftsman was an economic asset, and that meant the person who possessed the skill remained trapped within the same system. Workshops could also be dangerous. Metalworking involved intense heat, furnaces could burn skin, tools could cause serious injuries. Stonework exposed people to falling materials and dust. Pottery production required constant repetitive labor. Textile work could strain the body through long hours of sitting and repetitive movement. Even ordinary tools could become dangerous when used for hours every day. The ancient world had no modern workplace safety regulations. There were no protective helmets designed for industrial work, no standardized safety training, no insurance system waiting to help an injured worker. If an enslaved person was hurt, Their future depended upon the owner. Some owners might arrange treatment because the worker was valuable, others might simply replace the injured person. This was one of the cruel calculations built into the system. Human life could be measured economically, a broken tool could be repaired, a damaged building could be rebuilt, and a damaged worker might be considered replaceable. Yet we should also remember that enslaved workers were not passive figures. They were farmers, builders, craftspeople, artists, technicians. Their knowledge helped create the physical world of Rome, the roads beneath Roman feet, the pottery used at dinner, the tools used by soldiers and farmers, the clothing worn by ordinary people, the buildings that still capture our imagination today. Much of the empire's material life depended upon skilled labor, and much of that labor came from people who did not control their own lives. As the afternoon fades, we leave the workshops behind. The sound of hammers grows quieter, the fields become darker, workers return from the day's labor, but not everyone is going home. Some will be taken somewhere far more dangerous, deep beneath the earth, where sunlight disappears. The Roman economy depended upon metals, gold, silver, copper, iron. These materials helped build wealth, armies, tools, and cities, and to extract them, someone had to enter the mines. For many enslaved people, the mine was not simply another workplace, it was a place where the boundary between labor and survival became dangerously thin, and tomorrow, we descend into the darkness. The road ends where the sunlight begins to disappear. Behind us are the open fields, the workshops, the quiet farms. Ahead, the landscape becomes rougher. Rocky hills rise against the horizon, and the earth beneath our feet is no longer simply something to walk upon. It is something to be opened, to be cut, to be broken apart, because deep beneath the Roman world, there is wealth waiting in the darkness: gold, silver, copper, iron, salt, marble. The Roman Empire needed enormous quantities of these materials. Coins required precious metals, weapons required iron, buildings required stone, tools required metal, and every piece of material extracted from the earth represented someone else's labor. Sometimes that labor belonged to enslaved people. Roman mines existed across many regions of the empire. Some were controlled by the state, others were operated by private interests. The conditions varied greatly, but certain forms of mining were notoriously dangerous. A person entering a mine could face darkness, unstable rock, poor air, flooding, and exhausting physical labor. There was no modern machinery to make the work easier. Workers relied upon simple tools: hammers, pickaxes, baskets, wooden supports. Their bodies did much of the work. Imagine descending into the earth before sunrise, and realizing that the day outside has already disappeared. The light becomes weaker. Then it is gone, only lamps remain, small flames flickering against enormous walls of stone. The air may feel damp. The passage narrow, every sound echoes. A hammer strikes rock, again and again. The rhythm continues through the darkness. A worker might spend hours breaking apart stone, others carried the fragments away. Some moved material through narrow passages, others worked near the surface, processing what had been extracted. The entire operation depended upon human effort, and the deeper the mine went, the more dangerous it could become. Rock could collapse. Water could enter tunnels. Air could become difficult to breathe. A lamp might suddenly go out. Even finding a way back could become difficult in a complicated underground system. The ancient Romans understood some of these dangers. They developed methods for ventilation and drainage. They used engineering techniques to reach deeper deposits, but technology had limits, and the people performing the work often had very little power to protect themselves. Some mining laborers were enslaved, Others may have been condemned criminals or people forced into labor through legal punishment. This made the mines particularly feared. For someone sentenced to the mines, the punishment could be extremely harsh. The work itself could damage the body. Dust filled the air, heavy loads strained muscles, repetitive movements injured joints, long exposure to difficult conditions weakened people over time, and unlike domestic service, there was little opportunity for comfort. A person working inside a wealthy household might at least live beneath a roof surrounded by familiar faces. A miner entered darkness. The world above became distant. The sound of the outside world disappeared. Perhaps the most unsettling part was the feeling of time itself. Inside the mine, morning and evening meant almost nothing. The sun could rise, the sun could set, and the worker might never see either. Only the lamps marked the passage of hours. The darkness became a second sky, and the underground world developed its own strange rhythm. Hammer, stone, footsteps, breathing, silence, then hammer again. For someone who had once lived beneath an open sky, this could feel like another planet. Yet even here, people created small moments of human connection. Workers spoke to one another, shared warnings, helped carry heavy loads, perhaps exchanged stories during brief pauses. A few words could become precious in a place where the walls seemed endless, and when a worker finally returned to the surface, the sunlight might feel almost painful. The sky would appear impossibly wide. Fresh air would fill the lungs. For a moment, the world would seem enormous again. But then the next shift would come, back into the earth, back into darkness, back to the sound of stone breaking beneath the Roman world. Not every enslaved person experienced a mine, but the existence of such places reveals the extremes of Roman slavery. A person's fate could depend upon the skills they possessed, or upon the location where they were sold, or simply upon the decision of someone who owned them. And if the work was dangerous enough, the threat was not limited to exhaustion or injury. There was another fear, punishment, because throughout Roman society, enslaved people lived under systems of discipline that could be severe. An owner had enormous power, and when that power was challenged, or even when an owner believed it had been challenged, the consequences could be frightening. So we leave the darkness of the mine behind. We return slowly toward the surface, toward the villas, farms, workshops, and crowded streets of Rome. The sunlight is waiting, but beneath the warm Roman sky, another shadow follows us. The knowledge that for an enslaved person, a mistake, an accusation, or an act of resistance could bring punishment. And in the next chapter, we will quietly examine the methods masters used to control the people they owned. Some were designed to cause pain, others were designed simply to create fear, and sometimes the fear of punishment was enough. The mine fades behind us, the darkness beneath the earth slowly gives way to sunlight again. We return to the Roman countryside, where the fields stretch quietly beneath the sky, and the roads carry people toward distant towns and cities. But something has changed. We now understand that the dangers of slavery were not limited to hard work. There was another force shaping daily life, the fear of punishment for an enslaved person. The consequences of disobedience could depend heavily upon the owner, the circumstances, and the place where they lived. Roman society was deeply unequal. An enslaved person had very limited legal power compared with a free citizen. This imbalance gave owners enormous authority. And although Roman law could place certain limits on extreme treatment, the everyday reality remained uncertain. Punishment could take many forms. Sometimes it was physical, sometimes it was economic, sometimes it was psychological, and sometimes the threat itself was enough. A worker who made a mistake might be shouted at. Someone accused of stealing might face a harsher response. A servant who disobeyed could be punished. The severity depended upon the person in authority. This meant that life could be unpredictable. One household might respond to a mistake with anger that quickly passed, another might respond much more severely. The ancient Romans themselves recognized this danger. Writers occasionally described cruel masters, philosophers criticized excessive brutality, some Roman thinkers argued that enslaved people should be treated with humanity, but these ideas existed within a society that still accepted slavery itself. The contradiction was enormous. A person could argue that a slave owner should be kind, without questioning the right to own another human being. Among the punishments associated with Roman slavery was corporal punishment. Beatings could be used as discipline. Tools such as whips or rods were available, but the important point is not simply the existence of these objects, it is the atmosphere they created. A person did not need to be punished every day to live under the threat of punishment. The possibility could shape behavior. Workers learned to observe moods, to recognize danger, to avoid drawing attention, to understand when silence was safer than speaking. This created a strange kind of invisible labor. A person was not only performing physical tasks, they were constantly managing the emotions of people above them. There were also punishments that affected a person's position within the household. An owner might remove privileges, transfer someone to harder work, separate them from familiar companions, sell them elsewhere. For many enslaved people, the fear of being sold could be especially powerful. A person might know the streets of their current city, they might have friends, a partner, children, a familiar routine. Then, suddenly, all of it could disappear. The possibility of sale was therefore more than an economic threat. It was a threat to relationships, a threat to identity, a threat to belonging, and this is where punishment becomes difficult to separate from control. The system did not need to use physical violence constantly, it could also rely upon uncertainty. You did not know what might happen if you failed, you did not know whether a mistake would be forgiven, you did not know whether an angry owner would calm down, or decide to make an example of you. In some cases, punishment could become public. This served another purpose. Other enslaved people were watching. A punishment could send a message to everyone nearby. The message was simple: obey, remain useful, do not challenge authority. For those living inside large households, this could create an atmosphere of constant awareness. Workers watched, listened, adapted, and yet, despite the fear, resistance still existed. People ran away, some sabotaged work, some stole food. Some fought back in small ways, others resisted. By preserving their own identity, keeping a personal name, maintaining relationships, remembering a homeland, finding moments of independence wherever possible, resistance did not always look heroic. Sometimes, it was simply refusing to let the system erase every part of yourself. This is an important detail because the history of slavery is not only a history of suffering, it is also a history of human endurance. Enslaved people were not empty figures waiting for freedom. They had personalities, humor, friendships, ambitions, jealousies, dreams. They found ways to live within an unjust system. And sometimes, they found ways to create something resembling a life. One of the most complicated parts of that life was the question of relationships. Could an enslaved person marry? Could they build a family? Could they love someone without fear of separation? The answer is complicated, because in the Roman world, the law did not treat enslaved relationships in the same way it treated marriages between free citizens. And that meant love itself could exist, while security remained uncertain. So, as evening settles over the Roman streets, we leave the world of punishment behind. The sounds become quieter, the lamps begin to glow, and somewhere inside a crowded household, two people sit together after a long day. They may have no legal marriage certificate, no guarantee of a shared future, no certainty that tomorrow will leave them together, but they have each other. And now, we turn toward one of the most human questions of all. Could Roman slaves marry? The answer will reveal just how deeply slavery reached into the most private parts of a person's life. The evening is quiet now. Beyond the walls of the villa, the Roman streets are beginning to empty. The day's work is finished for some. The lamps are burning low, and in the darker corners of the city, away from the grand houses and public monuments, people are gathering together in small rooms and shared spaces. They talk quietly, they exchange stories, they think about tomorrow. And among them are couples who have built relationships despite living under the uncertain conditions of slavery. This brings us to a deeply human question. Could Roman slaves marry? The short answer is complicated. Roman law did not recognize the relationships of enslaved people in exactly the same way it recognized legal marriages between free Roman citizens. For free citizens, marriage was a formal social and legal institution. It could affect inheritance, family status, property, and the legitimacy of children. For enslaved people, the situation was different. An enslaved couple could form a long-term relationship, live together, and raise children. Roman society had a term for such relationships, often translated as a partnership or cohabitation. These relationships were real in the emotional sense, but they did not carry the same legal protection as marriage between free people, and that difference mattered, because the people involved did not control their own legal futures. An owner might permit two enslaved people to live together. The relationship might even be encouraged if it helped create a stable household, but permission was not the same as legal security. A couple could be separated, one partner might be sold, a person could be transferred to another estate. And suddenly, a relationship that had lasted for years could be broken apart. Imagine waking one morning and discovering that the person you loved had been taken away. There might be no court where you could demand that they be returned, no legal contract protecting your family, no guarantee that you would ever see them again. This possibility existed in the background of many enslaved relationships, and yet, people still formed them. They loved. They cared for one another. They created families. They shared food, they protected children, they waited for one another at the end of long days. Human beings have always searched for connection, even in circumstances designed to control them. For some enslaved couples, relationships may have offered emotional stability in a world where almost everything else was uncertain. A familiar face could become a source of comfort. A partner could understand the exhaustion of the workday without explanation. Two people might share memories of the same homeland, or perhaps they had both been born into slavery and knew no other life. The relationship could take many forms. Some couples may have lived together in the same household. Others may have been connected across different properties. In those cases, visiting each other could become difficult. Distance mattered. An owner might permit visits, or refuse them. The couple had little power to change the decision. Children added another layer of uncertainty. If an enslaved woman became pregnant, the child would generally inherit her enslaved status. This meant that family life could continue from one generation to another within the system. A child might grow up surrounded by parents, siblings, and grandparents, all enslaved, or a family might be divided by sale. The possibility of separation never completely disappeared, and yet, archaeological evidence and inscriptions give us glimpses of family connections, names carved into stone, memorials, grave inscriptions. Small references to relationships. These fragments remind us that enslaved people were not isolated individuals. They belonged to communities. They had parents, partners, children, friends, and people who remembered them after death. Some inscriptions suggest that relationships between enslaved people and freed people also existed. Manumission could change a person's legal status. A freed person might remain connected to an enslaved partner or family member. This could create complicated situations. One person was free, another remained enslaved. Their lives could still be linked by affection and responsibility. Perhaps the free partner worked toward purchasing the other's freedom. Perhaps they hoped to reunite their family. These stories are difficult to reconstruct because ancient sources rarely tell us the full emotional details. We often see only fragments, a name, a relationship, a few words carved into stone, but sometimes those fragments are enough. They remind us that even inside a system built around ownership, people continue to create bonds that the law could not completely erase, and perhaps that is why the subject of family is so important. Slavery could control a person's labor, it could control their movement, it could threaten their relationships, but it could not completely prevent people from caring for one another. Still, love could not protect everyone. A child born into an enslaved family entered the world already carrying a legal status they had never chosen. They inherited the condition of their mother, and as we leave the quiet courtyard behind, we begin to hear the soft sounds of a child. A small voice, a gentle laugh, tiny footsteps moving across a Roman floor. The child does not yet understand the meaning of the world around them, but the adults do, because for an enslaved mother and father, the birth of a child could bring both joy and a painful knowledge. The child they loved had been born into the same system, and that is where our journey continues, with the children who entered the Roman world already in chains, even if they had never seen chains at all. The room is quiet. A small child sleeps beneath a simple woven blanket while the household slowly begins another day. Outside, Rome is waking. Footsteps pass along the street. A cart moves over uneven stones. Someone calls to a neighbor. But inside this modest room, everything feels still. For the parents, the child's birth may have been a moment of joy. A new life had arrived. Small hands, a quiet breath, a face that resembled someone they loved. And yet, there was a painful truth waiting beneath that happiness. The child had been born into slavery. In Roman society, the status of a child was generally connected to the condition of the mother. If the mother was enslaved, the child was usually enslaved as well. This meant that slavery could continue from one generation to another. A child did not need to be captured, did not need to lose a war, did not need to be sold in a marketplace. They could simply be born, and from their first breath, the law had already decided something about their life. For the child, of course, none of this was understood. The world began with familiar voices, a mother's arms, a father's presence, the smell of cooking fires, the sounds of the household. A child might grow up believing that this was simply how life worked. There were free people, there were enslaved people, there were owners, there were workers. And the child belonged to the second group. Children born into slavery could grow up inside the household where their mothers worked. They might become familiar with the same rooms, the same courtyard, the same kitchen, the same people. A wealthy Roman child and an enslaved child could sometimes grow up side by side, yet their futures could be completely different. One might eventually inherit property, the other could be inherited as property. This contrast could begin early. An enslaved child might serve the children of the household. They could play together when young, share lessons, share games, perhaps even become close friends. But as they grew older, the difference between them would become clearer. The free child was preparing for a future. The enslaved child was preparing for work. Education depended upon circumstances. Some enslaved children in wealthy households could receive instruction. If their abilities were considered valuable, they might learn reading, writing, music, or accounting. A skilled, educated slave could be useful to an owner. But education was not provided simply because the child deserved it. It was usually connected to the needs of the household. A child trained as a teacher might later instruct other children. Someone who learned accounting could manage business records. Another might be taught a craft. The future was shaped by usefulness, and yet, children were still children. They laughed, they played, they became curious, they formed friendships, they learned the world through small discoveries. A child might chase a bird through a courtyard, play with a wooden toy, watch a craftsman working, listen to stories told by older workers. These ordinary moments remind us that history is not made only from grand events. Sometimes it is found in the quiet life of a child who never appears in any historical record. But childhood could also end early. Roman society expected children to grow into useful adults. For an enslaved child, this often meant learning responsibilities at a young age, helping with simple household tasks, carrying small objects, assisting in the kitchen, watching younger children, learning agricultural work. The transition from childhood to labor could happen gradually. There might be no clear moment when childhood ended. One day, the child simply found themselves working more and playing less. For families, the greatest fear was often separation. A child could be sold, a mother could be transferred, a father could be sent elsewhere. The family might remain together for years, or be divided without warning. This possibility affected the way people experienced family life. Every happy moment carried uncertainty. Every birthday was another reminder that the child was growing older within a system they could not control, and yet, families continued to care for one another. Parents taught children how to survive. They passed down languages, stories, songs, skills, memories of places they might never see again. In this way, enslaved families preserved pieces of their identity. A child might inherit more than a legal status. They might inherit a cultural tradition, a name, a story about an ancestor, a recipe remembered from another land, a prayer, a song whispered at night. These things could survive even when freedom did not, and sometimes, a child born into slavery eventually became free. Perhaps their owner granted manumission. Perhaps they were able to purchase freedom later in life. But freedom was never guaranteed. For many children, slavery was not a temporary chapter. It was the entire world they knew. They might grow old within it, they might die within it, and the people who remembered them might never know how different their lives could have been. As the child in our quiet room grows older, the story begins to change. The world that once seemed small becomes larger. The child notices the difference between people, between free and enslaved, between those who give orders and those who obey. And among the enslaved children growing up in Roman households were girls who faced particular expectations. Their lives could involve domestic labor, childcare, textile work, and responsibilities that followed them from childhood into adulthood. For them, slavery carried burdens that were often deeply personal and sometimes hidden from the historical record. So, as the child grows into a young woman, we follow her into the next chapter, a world of household duties, uncertain relationships, motherhood, and the complicated burdens carried by female slaves in ancient Rome. The sun has begun to fade across the Roman countryside. The last light rests gently upon tiled rooftops and olive trees. Inside the homes of the wealthy, lamps are being lit. The day's work is slowly coming to an end. But for many enslaved women, the responsibilities of the day are not yet finished. Their work could take many forms. Some cleaned rooms, some prepared food, some spun wool and made textiles, others cared for children, some worked in fields. Some served as personal attendants, and some possessed specialized skills that made them valuable to their owners. Their lives could be very different from one another. There was no single experience shared by every enslaved woman in Rome. A woman working in a wealthy urban household might spend her days surrounded by marble and painted walls. Another might work outdoors on an agricultural estate. Someone else could labor in a workshop, and another might be trained as a wet nurse, hairdresser, or skilled domestic servant. Yet beneath these differences was a shared vulnerability. Their bodies and personal lives were often controlled by others. For women, slavery could involve burdens that were deeply connected to family and reproduction. An enslaved woman who became pregnant could give birth to a child who was also enslaved. This meant that motherhood existed within a system where the family had little legal protection. A mother could love her child deeply, while knowing that another person had the power to separate them. That fear could remain in the background of everyday life. There were also women who worked as wet nurses. In wealthy Roman families, a wet nurse might be responsible for feeding an infant. This was physically demanding work, and it could create complicated emotional relationships. A woman might spend months caring for another family's child, while her own child was elsewhere. The ancient sources sometimes mention enslaved wet nurses, but they rarely tell us what these women felt. Did they miss their own children? Did they become attached to the infants they cared for? Did they resent the circumstances? We can rarely know. History leaves us with fragments, and sometimes the silence itself tells us something. Female domestic workers could also be responsible for personal care. They might help dress their mistresses, arrange hair, prepare cosmetics, carry clothing, assist with bathing. These duties required physical closeness. The servant might know the private habits of the person they served, their daily routines, their fears, their illnesses, their family problems. Yet the relationship remained unequal. A servant could be trusted and still be owned. She could be treated with affection and still have no control over her future. This complicated closeness was part of life inside wealthy Roman homes. There were also women who worked in textile production. Spinning and weaving were essential industries. Wool had to be cleaned, fibers prepared, thread spun, cloth woven. These tasks could take countless hours. The work was repetitive. The hands moved again and again. The rhythm could become almost hypnotic. For some women, the loom may have been part of daily life from childhood onward. They learned the craft from older workers. They passed knowledge to younger girls. The work continued across generations, and while some women worked inside households, others labored outdoors. Agricultural estates required workers for planting, harvesting, food preparation, and animal care. Women could be involved in these tasks as well. The idea that slavery was only about male labor misses much of the reality. Women were essential to the functioning of Roman households and economies. They produced goods, raised children, prepared food, maintained homes, and helped preserve the daily rhythm of society. But their vulnerability could be especially intense because their personal relationships were often exposed to decisions made by others. A woman could be separated from her partner, her children could be sold, she could be transferred to another household, and she had limited ability to challenge these decisions. Yet even within these constraints, women created their own communities. They shared advice, helped one another, cared for children, passed down traditions, and formed friendships. These connections may have been some of the most important sources of emotional support available to them. A whispered conversation while spinning wool, a shared meal after work, a comforting hand placed on someone's shoulder. Small gestures, but meaningful ones. And there were also women who eventually became free. Some were manumitted by their owners. Some may have accumulated money and purchased their freedom. Others were freed after years of service. Their lives after freedom could be complicated. They might remain connected to former owners. They could become workers, business owners, or members of Roman communities. But the memory of slavery did not simply disappear. The past could follow a person into freedom, and so, as the evening deepens, we leave the quiet household behind. The sound of spinning thread fades, the lamps glow softly, and somewhere in the distance, a different kind of spectacle is beginning. Crowds are gathering, torches are burning, the city is becoming louder. Inside enormous public arenas, thousands of people are waiting to be entertained. The city grows louder as evening approaches. From the quiet courtyard where enslaved women once spun wool, we now follow the distant sound of footsteps. Crowds are gathering, torches flicker along the streets, vendors call to passing visitors. The smell of bread, roasted meat, and wine drifts through the air, and somewhere ahead, a great stone arena waits for the people entering. This is entertainment. For those inside, it is something else entirely. The gladiators are among the most famous enslaved people of ancient Rome. Their image has survived for centuries. We imagine armored fighters, crowded arenas, roaring audiences. But the reality was more complicated than the stories often suggest. Not every gladiator was enslaved. Some were free people who voluntarily entered the profession. Others were prisoners of war or enslaved individuals forced into gladiatorial training. Their lives varied enormously. Some became famous, some earned money, some gained the admiration of the crowd, and some died young. The training itself could be demanding. Gladiators were often trained in specialized schools called ludi. These were not simply prisons, they were places where fighters lived and trained. The people running them had an economic interest in keeping valuable gladiators alive. A well-trained fighter represented an investment. This created a strange contradiction. The gladiator was forced into a dangerous profession. Yet the person controlling him might also want to protect his body. A successful gladiator could become valuable. He might attract crowds, win matches, build a reputation, and bring profit to the people who managed him. Inside the training schools, fighters learned specific techniques. Different types of gladiators used different equipment. Some carried large shields, others fought with lighter weapons, some wore distinctive helmets. The fights were carefully organized. They were not simply random battles. There were rules, referees, officials, an elaborate tradition surrounding the events. But rules did not make the arena safe. A fight could still end in serious injury or death. The audience watched from enormous stone seats. Thousands of people could gather. The atmosphere must have been extraordinary. Imagine sitting among a crowd that stretches around the arena. The sunlight is bright. The stone walls rise around you. Music plays. The crowd reacts. Then the gates open. A fighter steps into the arena. For the gladiator, every movement matters. Every breath, every decision. The crowd may be cheering, but the person standing in the center knows that the consequences are real. And yet, there was another side to gladiatorial life: fame. Some gladiators became celebrities. Their names were remembered, their victories celebrated. People could admire their strength and skill. Women, especially, appear in some ancient accounts as being fascinated by gladiators. The combination of danger, fame, and physical strength created a powerful image. For a person who had begun life without freedom, fame could offer something unusual, a sense of identity. The gladiator was still controlled, still owned or contracted under the system, but the public knew his name. People recognized him. His achievements belonged to him in a way that many enslaved workers could not experience. This did not make the system fair, it simply created a strange form of status within slavery. The most successful gladiators could sometimes receive gifts or money. Some eventually received a wooden sword called a rudis. This symbolized freedom from gladiatorial combat. For certain fighters, it marked the beginning of a new life, but not everyone reached that moment. Many died before freedom became possible. Others survived injuries that permanently changed their bodies. The arena therefore contained both possibility and danger. A person could enter as an enslaved fighter and leave as a free man, or never leave at all. For the Roman audience, these stories were part of the spectacle. The crowd might cheer for a favorite fighter, they might remember his victories, they might feel sympathy when he was defeated, but when the gates closed, the gladiator's fate remained in the hands of others. And perhaps that is why gladiators became such powerful symbols. They represented something the Roman public could understand immediately: a human being placed into a dangerous world, forced to perform, watched by thousands, yet even within that world, people searched for ways to survive, to become skilled, to become respected, to become remembered, and sometimes to become free. As the arena empties, the noise slowly fades, the torches burn lower, the spectators disappear into the streets. Somewhere behind the walls, a gladiator returns to the training school. Perhaps he survived another fight, perhaps he wonders how many more remain, but there is one possibility he may still dream about: a day when someone places the wooden sword in his hands and tells him he is no longer a slave. The arena is quiet now, the crowds have gone home, the sand has settled, and the great stone gates stand beneath the night sky. But somewhere beyond those walls, another kind of struggle continues, not with weapons, but with time. For an enslaved person in ancient Rome, the dream of freedom could take many forms. Some hoped their owner might eventually release them, others imagined earning enough money to purchase their freedom, and some simply waited, without knowing whether freedom would ever come. The Roman system allowed enslaved people to be freed through a process known as manumission. The word itself meant release from slavery, but the path toward freedom was not always simple. An owner could free an enslaved person in different ways. Sometimes the decision was made formally, sometimes it happened through less official arrangements. A person might be freed during the owner's lifetime, or freedom might be promised in a will. For the enslaved person, the difference between these possibilities could mean everything. Imagine spending years working in a household, knowing that one day, perhaps, your owner might decide to release you. There was no guarantee, no fixed schedule, no promise that freedom would arrive at a certain age. The decision belonged to someone else. This uncertainty could shape an entire life. Some enslaved people were able to accumulate money. Roman law generally did not allow slaves to own property in the same way free people did, but an enslaved person could sometimes control what was known as a peculium, a collection of money or property placed under their management. The legal ownership remained complicated. The money was not fully theirs in the modern sense, yet it could sometimes be used to negotiate freedom. A person might save small amounts over many years. Perhaps they received money from additional work. Perhaps they were allowed to keep tips or gifts. Perhaps they earned money through specialized skills. Little by little, the dream of freedom could become a number, a price, a goal. Imagine counting coins in the quiet of the night, wondering how many more were needed. 1 year passes, then another. The amount grows slowly, and yet, the owner still has the final authority. This made manumission a strange mixture of hope and dependence. The enslaved person might work toward freedom, while still working for the person who controlled it. Some owners freed enslaved people because they valued their service. Others may have done so as a reward. Some might release older workers, some freed people in their wills. The reasons varied. For the owner, manumission could also have economic advantages. A freed person might continue working. They could remain connected to the former owner. The relationship simply changed. This was known as the relationship between a freed person and a former master or patron. Freedom did not always mean complete independence. A freed person could still have obligations. They might owe certain services. They could remain socially connected to the household. In some cases, they depended upon their former owner for protection or opportunities, so the moment of freedom was not always a clean break. It was more like crossing a narrow bridge. Behind you, slavery; ahead, a new life. But the road forward was uncertain. For many freed people, however, freedom opened possibilities that had never existed before. They could build businesses, earn money, form legal marriages, raise children whose status was different from their own childhood. Some became successful merchants, some worked in trades, others remained poor. Freedom did not erase economic inequality. A freed person could still struggle, but they possessed something profoundly important: greater control over their own life. And perhaps the most moving part of manumission was the change it could create across generations. A person who had been born enslaved could eventually become free. Their children could be born free. Their family could move into a different social position. The transformation might take decades. But it was real. Roman society even developed a large population of freed people. They became part of the city's economic and social life. Some became wealthy, some gained influence, a few rose surprisingly high. Their stories remind us that the Roman world was more complicated than a simple division between free and enslaved. People could move between these categories, but the journey was rarely equal. For every person who reached freedom, many others remained enslaved, and for every story of successful manumission, there were countless lives that ended before freedom arrived. Still, the possibility mattered. It gave people something to imagine, a future beyond the household, beyond the workshop, beyond the fields, beyond the mine. Perhaps an enslaved person standing beside a Roman road could look at a free traveler and wonder, what would it feel like to walk wherever I wanted, to earn money that belonged to me, to choose where I lived, to marry without fear of being separated, to know that my children were born free? These questions could become powerful dreams, and some people did more than dream. They became free, they built new lives, and in a few extraordinary cases, they became important enough that history remembered their names. As the Roman night deepens, we leave the quiet story of an ordinary person hoping for freedom and turn toward those unusual individuals whose lives rose above the silence. Some were educated, some became wealthy, some gained extraordinary influence, and some left their mark on Roman history in ways that still surprise us today. They began as slaves, but their names survived long after their chains were gone. And so, in the next chapter, we will meet the famous slaves and former slaves who changed the course of ancient Rome. The Roman street is beginning to wake. Morning light touches the rooftops. Shadows slowly retreat from ancient walls, and somewhere in the distance, footsteps move toward the markets. For most enslaved people, history would never record their names. They lived, they worked, they loved, they grew old, and eventually, they disappeared into the quiet darkness of the past, but a few somehow remained visible. Their names survived because their lives became connected to politics, literature, philosophy, religion, or the immense machinery of the Roman Empire. Their stories remind us of something important: a person could begin life without freedom and still influence the world around them. One of the most remarkable examples is Epictetus. He was born into slavery in the 1st century of the Roman Empire. His exact birthplace is uncertain, but he eventually came to Rome, where he became associated with the household of a powerful imperial official. Unlike many enslaved people, Epictetus received an education, he studied philosophy, and eventually, he became a teacher himself. After gaining his freedom, he continued teaching philosophy. His ideas later became famous through the writings of his students. What makes his story so fascinating is the contrast between his early life and his later influence. He had once belonged to another person, yet his teachings eventually reached people across centuries. His philosophy emphasized the importance of controlling one's own response to circumstances. We cannot always control what happens to us, but we can try to control how we respond. For someone who had experienced slavery, this idea carried a particular weight. Epictetus understood what it meant to live without complete control over external circumstances. His life did not erase the reality of slavery, but it showed that intellectual influence could emerge from the most unexpected places. Another remarkable figure was Phaedrus. He was a former enslaved person who became known as a writer of fables. His stories adapted traditional tales and presented them in poetic form. Fables may seem simple: a fox, a crow, a lion, a clever animal trying to survive. But beneath these stories were observations about power, weakness, pride, and injustice. Perhaps it is not surprising that someone who had experienced a deeply unequal society might understand these themes well. Phaedrus's work reminds us that literature could provide another form of freedom, the freedom to observe, to criticize, to speak indirectly, to tell stories that revealed truths without openly confronting powerful people. Then there were countless others whose names survive only in fragments, inscriptions on stone, names carved onto tombs, records of businesses, documents mentioning workers, people who managed accounts, people who worked as teachers, people who became craftsmen, people who earned freedom. Their stories rarely became famous, but they were part of the Roman world, and some former slaves achieved remarkable economic success. Freed people could become merchants, craftsmen, business owners, administrators. Some accumulated considerable wealth. The Roman economy provided opportunities for certain freed people to rise socially. This was especially true in large cities where commerce was constantly expanding. One fascinating example is the world of imperial administration. The Roman emperors employed enormous numbers of workers. Some had been enslaved, others were later freed. These individuals could become involved in managing finances, correspondence, and government affairs. A person who began life as a slave could eventually become close to the center of imperial power. This was unusual, but it happened. The stories of such people reveal a strange contradiction. The Roman Empire depended upon slavery. Yet the same system sometimes allowed enslaved individuals to become highly educated and powerful. Their success did not mean the system was humane. It simply meant that individual lives could develop in unexpected directions. Perhaps the most important lesson is that history often remembers the unusual. We know the names of philosophers, writers, officials, gladiators, wealthy freed people, but for every famous person, there were thousands whose names disappeared. The woman who worked in a kitchen, the farmer who harvested grapes, the child born into a household, the miner who disappeared beneath the earth, the craftsman who shaped tools. Their names may be lost, but their labor remains visible. Roman buildings still stand, ancient roads still cross landscapes. Pottery survives beneath the soil, coins remain in museums. The physical world of Rome was built through the work of countless people, many of whom left no written record, and perhaps that is why the famous former slaves are so important. They give us a doorway Through their stories, we can glimpse the lives of people who otherwise might have vanished completely. But even the most successful freed person eventually faced the same truth as everyone else: life was temporary. Freedom could change a person's legal status, but it could not stop time. Eventually, every worker grew older, every body became weaker, and every Roman life, whether free or enslaved, eventually reached its final day. For an enslaved person, that final day could come after decades of work. It could come in a quiet household, on a distant farm, in a workshop, or far beneath the ground. And when the end arrived, what happened to them? Were they remembered? Were they buried? Did anyone mourn them? Or did their lives simply disappear? As the sunlight begins to fade across the Roman city, we leave behind the extraordinary people whose names survived, and return to the ordinary men and women whose stories remain mostly unknown, because the final chapter of a slave's life was often the quietest, and perhaps the most forgotten. Next, we will follow that final journey toward old age, death, memory, and the strange silence that comes when an entire life disappears from history. The city is quiet tonight. The markets have closed. The workshops have gone dark. The last voices are fading from the streets, and somewhere, inside a small room beneath the shadow of a wealthy Roman house, an old man is lying awake. His body is tired. His hands are worn. The years have left their marks. He has spent most of his life working. Perhaps he was born into slavery. Perhaps he was captured as a child. Perhaps he arrived in Rome from a distant province, carried across the Mediterranean and sold to someone whose name he never expected to remember. Now, he is old, and the world around him continues moving. This is where the history of ordinary enslaved people becomes especially difficult to see. Ancient sources often tell us about emperors, generals, writers, philosophers, wealthy families, but the ordinary enslaved person rarely left behind a detailed biography. Their lives disappeared quietly, and yet, their final years were part of the Roman world too. Growing old while enslaved could be frightening. The body that once carried heavy loads became weaker. The hands that worked all day could no longer move as quickly. The eyes became less sharp. The back became painful. For someone whose value had been measured by labor, old age could create uncertainty. What happened when a worker could no longer perform the tasks expected of them? The answer depended upon the owner. Some elderly enslaved people may have remained within households. They could perform lighter duties, watching children, cleaning, sorting materials, preparing simple foods. Their usefulness changed, but did not necessarily disappear. Others may have received care from fellow workers. An enslaved community could become a place of support. People who had worked beside one another for decades might look after the elderly. A friend might bring food. A family member might help with daily tasks. A younger worker might carry water. These acts rarely appear in official histories, but they were part of human life, and perhaps they were essential, because slavery could control a person's legal status, but it could not prevent people from caring for one another. Some enslaved people may have been freed in old age. Manumission could sometimes occur after many years of service. For an elderly person, freedom might arrive late, very late, perhaps after decades of waiting. The moment could be deeply meaningful, and yet complicated. Freedom at 60 or 70 was different from freedom at 20. The person had gained legal independence, but they had lost much of their life to someone else's control. Still, even late freedom could matter. A person could finally make decisions for themselves. Perhaps they could choose where to live. Perhaps they could form a legal marriage. Perhaps they could earn money without being owned. Perhaps they could simply walk through the city knowing that no one had the legal right to sell them. For some, that may have been enough. For others, freedom never came. Eventually, the body stopped. The final illness might have been ordinary: fever, infection, old age, an injury that never healed. The ancient world had medicine, doctors existed, some treatments were surprisingly sophisticated. But medical care was uneven, and enslaved people did not all have equal access to it. When death approached, the people around the dying person became important: a spouse, a child, a friend, a fellow worker. Someone might sit beside the bed, someone might hold a hand, someone might whisper a final word, and then the person was gone. For a wealthy Roman, death could involve elaborate funerary rituals. Large tombs, inscriptions, portraits, memorials. For an enslaved person, burial could be much simpler. Some were buried in communal or modest graves, others may have been cremated. The exact practice varied across time and place, but even enslaved people could be remembered. Sometimes names appear in inscriptions. A simple stone might identify a person, a relationship might be mentioned, a spouse, a child, a friend. These small inscriptions are precious because they return individuality to people who were often treated as property during life. A name carved into stone says, "Someone knew me, someone remembered me, I existed," and perhaps that is the quietest tragedy of slavery. Not only that people suffered, but that so many lived entire lives without leaving enough evidence for us to know who they were. Their stories are hidden beneath the foundations of cities, in the roads, the farms, the workshops, the villas, the mines. Their labor shaped Rome even when their names disappeared. So imagine that old man again. The room is dark, an oil lamp burns beside him, someone sits quietly nearby, perhaps a friend, perhaps a family member. Perhaps no one at all. Outside, Rome continues. A cart passes, a dog barks, the city breathes, and somewhere in that enormous empire, another ordinary life comes to an end. No trumpet sounds, no monument is built. The world simply moves forward, but perhaps someone remembers a name, a face, a voice, a story told once more, and that may be enough to keep a person from completely disappearing. As the night deepens, we slowly leave that quiet room. We have followed the life of the Roman slave from the moment of capture or birth, through markets, households, kitchens, fields, mines, families, arenas, and dreams of freedom. Now there is only one final place to go, back to the beginning, back to the quiet question that has followed us all night. What does it mean to remember people whose lives were almost erased, and perhaps, what can their stories still teach us? So, as dawn begins to approach over the ancient rooftops, we prepare to say goodbye, and not with another list of facts, not with another grand scene, but with a final thought about the millions of ordinary people who lived beneath the surface of Roman history, people who were owned, yet still dreamed, people who were controlled, yet still loved, people whose names may be forgotten, but whose lives helped build a world that we still remember today. The night is almost over. Beyond the ancient rooftops, the first hint of morning is beginning to appear. The sky above Rome is no longer completely dark, it is becoming softer, paler, and somewhere in the distance, the city is preparing to wake. A baker will soon light a fire, a farmer will walk into a field, a merchant will open a shop, a servant will carry water, a child will wake beside a parent, and somewhere, perhaps, a person will begin another day without anyone remembering their name. Tonight, we have traveled quietly through their world. We began before sunrise, with people whose time belonged to someone else. We followed them through crowded markets where human lives were bought and sold. We entered wealthy villas where beautiful rooms depended upon invisible labor. We stood beside smoky kitchens. We imagined simple sleeping spaces. We shared ordinary meals of bread, grain, olives, and vegetables. We walked through fields beneath the hot Roman sun. We entered workshops where hands shaped clay, wood, and metal, and then we descended into the darkness of the mines. We saw the uncertainty of punishment, the fragile nature of family, the childhood of those born into slavery, the particular burdens carried by enslaved women, and the strange world of the gladiator, where a person might become famous while still lacking control over their own life. Then we followed the quiet dream of freedom. Manumission, a word that could represent years of waiting, years of saving, years of hoping. For some, freedom finally arrived. For others, it never did. And through the stories of famous former slaves, we discovered that history sometimes remembers the people it once tried to control, but most were not famous, most did not become philosophers, writers, gladiators, business owners, or important officials. Most simply lived, and perhaps that is the part worth remembering most, because when we think about ancient Rome, we often imagine marble temples, triumphant emperors, military victories, grand amphitheaters, beautiful statues. But beneath all of that, there were ordinary people, people who woke tired, people who worried about food, people who missed their families, people who fell in love, people who argued, people who laughed, people who hoped, people who dreamed of a future that might never come. The Roman slave system was enormous. It reached into homes, farms, workshops, mines, markets, and public entertainment. But slavery never completely erased the humanity of the people trapped inside it. That is perhaps the greatest lesson hidden beneath the ancient stones. A person can be treated as property and still know that they are a person. A person can lose their freedom and still hold memories that belong only to them. A person can be separated from their homeland and still carry its language in their mind. A person can be denied control over their future and still dream. Those dreams may have been small: a warm meal, a quiet night, a visit with someone they loved, a little money saved, a child who remained close. Perhaps, one day, freedom. History often looks for great moments, battles, revolutions, famous speeches. But human history is also made from small hopes, and those hopes can survive in the most difficult circumstances. Today, we can walk through the ruins of Rome, we can touch ancient stones, we can admire the architecture, we can stand beneath arches built nearly 2,000 years ago. But when we do, perhaps we should remember the people who carried the stones, the people who dug the foundations, the people who cooked the food, the people who cleaned the rooms, the people who harvested the crops, the people who worked beneath the earth. Many of them left no statues, no monuments, no biographies. Their names disappeared, but their lives were real, and perhaps, in the end, that is enough reason to remember them. The sun is rising now, the Roman city is waking, our journey is almost finished. So, wherever you are listening tonight, perhaps let your thoughts become quiet. Imagine the ancient streets slowly filling with morning light. Imagine the sound of footsteps fading into the distance. Imagine the lamps being extinguished one by one. And remember, behind every grand civilization are ordinary human beings. Some remembered, many forgotten, all once alive. And if you have enjoyed this quiet journey through history, you can leave a gentle thought below. Perhaps tell us where you are listening from, or simply share what time it is where you are. Because even now, thousands of years later, people from distant places can gather together and remember those who once lived so long ago. But there is one final thought I would like to leave with you. The Romans built an empire that seemed almost eternal. Their roads remain, their buildings remain, their laws influence generations. Their language shaped the modern world, and yet, the lives of millions of enslaved people were nearly erased, so perhaps history leaves us with a quiet mystery. If an entire civilization can remember its emperors, while forgetting the names of the people who built their world, then how much of the past do we truly know? And perhaps, somewhere beneath the dust of an ancient Roman road, there is still a name waiting to be discovered, a name carved into stone. A forgotten letter. A small piece of pottery, a hidden inscription, something that might suddenly tell us who someone was, what they dreamed about, who they loved, and what they hoped the future would become. Maybe one day, archaeologists will uncover another fragment, and another forgotten voice will return. Until then, the ancient world remains quiet. The lamps have gone out, the streets are empty, the last shadows are disappearing beneath the morning sun, and somewhere, in the silence between one age and another, the forgotten people of Rome are still waiting for us to remember them. Good night, and sleep peacefully.